All right, welcome everybody to the episode 3 of GMI Rocket, where we're talking to founders, immigration tech founders, immigration lawyers about immigration tech and marketing and all the good things regarding growth in the immigration space. Today, I'm really excited to have my friend and fellow immigration lawyer turned immigration tech startup founder, Josh Schachnow. He's actually a Canadian immigration lawyer, which is awesome. It's our first international episode, and we're going to chat with Josh about all the things he's done in terms of being an immigration lawyer as a founder, how he launched his own venture, where he's at now, and kind of where we see immigration tech both in the US and in Canada and perhaps globally going in the future. So, Josh, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me, Roman. Appreciate it. And I'm very much looking forward to the chat.
Yeah, likewise. So, you and I we've known each other for a bit. We're kind of in the same boat here. We're both lawyers who sort of turned into immigration tech startup founders, although you do practice immigration law still, right?
Correct.
Yeah. And we'll get to sort of where you're at now, and Canadian immigration is blowing up right now. I'm sad to say that as a U.S. immigration lawyer, but, also happy for you guys, and just like really excited to see how trends shift and how things change with both coronavirus, pandemic, quarantine, and also just what's happening with U.S. immigration. But, before we get into all that, I realize with a lot of these episodes is that even if I know you and I know about your company and sort of where you're at, I don't often know kind of your origin story and how you got to become a lawyer. I know that I didn't always want to be a lawyer. I just kind of fell into it. Same thing with immigration. So, why don't we start there? Can you share a little bit about, did you always want to be a lawyer? And when you entered law school, did you know you want to be an immigration lawyer? And sort of how did all that happen?
Yeah, so I totally fell into immigration law, but I knew from day zero that I wanted to be a lawyer. And it's almost hard to pinpoint because I've always wanted to be a lawyer for so long that I honestly can't remember not wanting to be a lawyer, right? And we go to university and people switch their majors in undergrad and they're not sure what they want to do. The beautiful part of my childhood was that there was never even a second option of what I was going to go to school and become. And I think part of that is probably, certain values and things instilled by family. Some of that is the way society and the media projects the benefits of what it's like being a lawyer, and kind of the intellectual stimulation and challenges that kind of came from the profession just always drew me towards it. And so there was never a doubt in my mind. I knew two things. I wanted to go and do a BCom for my undergrad, and then I was going to go to law school. And that's what happened. And which is actually an interesting lesson in the sense that, as it relates to business, if you have one goal in mind, it's much easier to get it, right? It's much easier to focus on that one thing and make it come to fruition. So for those thinking about business or confused or stuck or struggling in business, pick one goal or result or end kind of result that you're looking towards getting to, and just focus everything else around getting to that one thing. And then it tends to work out.
Yeah, it's nice. It's like eliminate the noise. Have one goal, laser focus, put on the blinders. I mean, be open to different things, but put on the blinders and go forward.
For sure.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I'm similar to you. My undergrad was in financial economics, and then went to business school. I didn't want to be the quintessential lawyer that sort of hates math.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like, let me do math and then go back to law school.
Yeah, it's a good combo too. It doesn't hurt.
Absolutely. I mean, you got to do your accounting, you got to do all that stuff, even as a lawyer, especially as a solo, which we'll get into because, you opened up your own firm as well. So how was it that you fell into immigration specifically?
Yeah, so that's the complete opposite. So I, flopped ass backwards into immigration. Basically what happens in Canada is when you finish law school, now it does depend on the province, but in Ontario and in many other provinces, you have to article when you finish school. And what articling is basically the lawyer fancy word for doing, an internship for 10 months in Ontario. Most of them are paid, which is good. So I articled at more of a, smaller law firm in Ottawa where I'm born and raised. and was doing mostly a lot of civil litigation, which I wasn't a big fan of. And so when the articling came to an end, I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I knew I liked business. I knew I didn't really like civil litigation, didn't really like real estate, honestly didn't know what I wanted to do. And what happened was a few weeks after that, a good friend of mine reached out and said, "Hey, Josh, I know you're looking for kind of your next move. My dad is an immigration lawyer. He's semi-retiring. He's had his own practice for like 15 years. He's retiring, kind of closing up shop, but he's looking to kind of mentor or work with a younger lawyer to, stay active. And, you don't really want to go from full-time work to zero work." And I had zero knowledge of immigration law. I didn't take the course in law school. Our firm didn't do it when I articled. If you would have asked me in law school, I would have said that's probably the last topic I would want to take in class, And so what he said was, you should think about it, number one. Number two is Canada is starting to boom at this point in the tech industry. And there's some of these new programs that they're creating to make it easier for tech companies and tech workers to navigate immigration. I think you guys should take that angle. So anyways, I looked into it, probably spent a few days, maybe, I don't even remember, maybe a week. And I was like, you know what? This industry looks hot. And it was going to give me the chance to start my own practice, AKA start my own business, which I was always interested in. I have the BCom. I like the business aspects of it. So I said, what the heck, let's give it a try. And that's how I got into immigration law. That it was just that opportunity fell into my lap at the right time. And I just decided to try it. And here we are almost to the day, like 3 years later. And I couldn't be happier.
That's awesome. Yeah, I was going to ask you, so what year about was it when you finished your articling?
It was May of 2017 when I finished articling. And then I think I opened up my practice in August of 2017. Maybe it might have been June when I finished. I don't remember. There was about a month or two gap between finished the articling, taking some time off in the summer, and then in August started the practice.
So when you started this practice, did you take over this person's clients, or was it kind of like that where you sort of stepped into his shoes, or how did that work?
So totally new practice. He was closing his up. So I started my own, at the time, sole proprietorship, eventually ended up incorporating. And we started from scratch. He did, one of the things about immigration is it's a lot of kind of one-offs, especially he was working mostly with individuals and families and refugee stuff, which a little, can be a little bit more one-off. So he has since sent files, over the last 3 years, but he had done none of the tech or kind of corporate immigration that we ended up building out a practice around. Because if you go about 8 to 12 months later, all of my clients were corporate. They were all tech companies in and around Canada. And that we started from scratch. I did get some pretty good files from him from previous clients or referrals and stuff like that. But we ended up building a little niche practice around one program called the Global Talent Stream, which is an expedited work permit for tech workers. And all of that business was generated from scratch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, cool. And so, you become a lawyer, you kind of step into this practice, you're learning a little bit as you go, you take on some new clients, you take on some of his clients. And then you kind of like started to work on some kind of a tech product at that time, right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so probably about 8 or 10 months into my practice, we started getting into more of the corporate stuff, and I got connected with someone working out of the Bay Area who had an idea for immigration tech, which at that point in time was non-existent in Canada. And so I was definitely interested. Another one of the benefits of kind of running your own shop is you can dip your toes into other little opportunities that present themselves. And so we ended up co-founding a tech startup that was trying to pretty much automate the Global Talent Stream application, which was what I was becoming at that point not an expert in, but pretty good, pretty well versed in that program. And what we tried to build was a platform that would connect these engineers and developers from around the world with companies willing to sponsor them. So that's kind of the project that kicked it off. What ended up happening is I think we were a little bit too early. It also, anytime you kind of include that type of recruitment, which has an immigration piece, it just proved to be a not so scalable business model because there was a much longer life cycle in terms of actually selling the companies and then going through with the recruitment process. And then even once the hire is made, you then have to go through the immigration process. And at that point, I got really lucky because that Global Talent Stream program started 3 months before I started my practice. So one of the huge benefits of that was that there were no experts, right? Mm-hmm. So you could go to a 50-year, a lawyer was 50 years old. He's been practicing for 25 years, and he didn't know any more about it than I did, right? Because the program was so new. Now, the drawback was that none of the Canadian companies knew about it, and they had no experience with it. So selling it to them was that much more difficult. So the sales process was tough, and the life cycle of kind of the client journey was long, and it proved pretty quickly to be it probably would have been a really good cash flow business, but it did not prove itself to be a high growth, tech company. And so we stopped that, and it was kind of pivoted a little bit, but my involvement kind of weaned out after a few months from that. And
the company was called Pursuit, right?
Yes.
So, and just, kind of to dig in, because I think for folks listening, and even for me, right, starting my own, I haven't gone through multiple tech startups, right? I'm sort of on my first still. What was that like? I mean, did you raise money? Was it just like a side project that you were building while you were also practicing? Can you walk us through just a little bit of that just to get an understanding? Because obviously that will then have informed how you went about building Visto, which is what you're growing and scaling right now.
Yeah, that was pretty instrumental in many ways in terms of being an inspiration and learning experience for what is now Visto. But to answer the question, I have maintained my practice up until this very day, right? So what it allowed me to do was we were trying to build a process to automate Global Talent Stream. That's what I was doing in my practice. So not only did it allow for a lot of good overlap, it actually created some business for my practice because we were bringing on these clients that were looking to hire people through the Global Talent Stream. So it was an easy extension to be able to continue with both. But to go back to the question, there were 3 of us. We co-founded the company. The CEO raised a little bit of money, and we did give it our all to kind of prove out the business model. And I think business model was actually on its way to proving itself, but not towards being a high growth, scalable tech company. It was more of a cash flow, what could have been a pretty lucrative business, to be honest, because you can make pretty good money in terms of recruitment and immigration, especially when you put them together. But the 2 other co-founders and I kind of agreed, especially because from the outset, we had the vision of a high growth tech company, and this didn't seem like it was going to be one. Mm-hmm. And so, but I'll never forget like those first few meetings, right? Because we would have like a weekly stand up and then go do almost like our own kind of personal sprints. And I was like, wow, this is way more fun than sitting by myself and doing legal work at my desk, right? It was just like a breath of fresh air almost, kind of the hustle and grind of the early stage tech company, the creativity that has to go into it. I mean, I was doing a lot of like the growth hack stuff and whatever through my practice, but you kind of do it to a whole other level with a tech company. And I found that really interesting.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I totally relate. I can totally relate to that,
And the big benefit too was the 2 other co-founders were experienced in the tech space. So I'm seeing them, I'm seeing what they're doing, getting the lingo, right? The lay of the tech land. I went to San Francisco multiple times to do some work with them and work out of a co-working space. I'd never been to San Francisco, right? So you kind of, we'll call it, get a little taste of the Bay Area, which is very different from Toronto, although Toronto's catching up. but definitely very different from Ottawa, where I grew up, smaller government city. And I was waking up, right? It was opening my eyes to what the heck is out there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm from New York. That's where I'm at now. And even I remember going to San Francisco. I mean, I suppose I had a little bit of an expectation of, flying cars and such, but I definitely did see more people riding sort of scooters and those like self-balancing things and ear pods. And I mean, that sounds silly now, but this is a couple of years back. You could feel it. And also every old building has like Google, Twitter, Facebook, kind of some other cool stuff hanging on the side. So there's an air of innovation.
Well, it's cool too, and I'm interested to hear if you would agree that it was really interesting to break out of the legal bubble. Not that there's anything wrong with the legal bubble, but when you spend 4 years in undergrad doing business, then you spend 3 years in law school, you're surrounded by lawyers in training, then you article, you're just surrounded by lawyers, then you're practicing, you're kind of still kind of in that lawyer mindset and bubble. And I had no idea any of this even existed, right? Just the approach they take, the different types of companies. We ended up we made it to the interview stage of Y Combinator. I had no idea what the heck Y Combinator was until they were like, "Hey Josh, I think we should apply for this." And I was like, what's that? And then a couple months later, I'm flying down so we can go into the Y Combinator offices to get interviewed by, 4 of the Y Combinator, I don't know what they're called, LPs or managers, one of which like created the Facebook news feed. And, so it was just really cool experience. So if anybody kind of gets an opportunity like that, I recommend taking it.
Yeah. And I also want to say, kind of as we're talking, for folks listening, leave some comments if you're on Facebook, if you're on LinkedIn. Definitely leave some questions. We'll be, as we get through Josh's story, we'll be starting to answer questions about immigration tech, whether in Canada or the US, about the sort of lawyer to entrepreneur journey, or anything else. So definitely drop some comments and some questions into the comments. To answer your question, Josh, I definitely didn't know much about it, especially going into the legal space. I really kind of learned about the tech world through my immigration experience because our clients were tech startups. And so as part of the visa applications, I had to, learn about them. I had to put together sort of background documentation. And then of course I started getting more into it and started reading a lot more TechCrunch and things like that. And actually for me, it's so interesting how people fall into kind of where they currently are in life. I always wanted to start a company, but I never thought it would be a tech company. However, I started to realize that all these tech companies we were servicing, right, via immigration, they were sort of doing all this really cool, innovative stuff. And, it starts to change your mindset where you think like, wow, if all these people are building companies around solving problems, maybe there's a place for me in this world too, to solve a problem and sort of build a company around it. And then you start looking for problems. And then you start looking back into your daily life and saying, where are the problems that I'm upset about on a daily basis? Let me sort of like meditate on them and figure out a way of potentially, building a solution. So similar to you, man, I didn't know about it really until I got into the immigration space, but a little bit differently. But yeah, nevertheless, it was kind of an awakening as well. And also, to be fair, when I was growing up, I was the one with the computer in the room. So like I was building websites. I had a website for like my favorite rappers and stuff like that. I built them on HTML. I mean, and I remember when I was in college, and actually when I was in law school and then later working with it, I'm like, damn, software engineers are in such high demand, make such great money. Like I could have been the kid whose story would have been like, yeah, I was building websites since I was 10. But, I did that from 10 to 12 and then was like, oh, video games or like sports and just dropped the ball. But anywho, it was really interesting to kind of think about like how we got to like the tech space. All right. So you're still running your firm. You tried with Pursuit. You had some really awesome experiences. You worked with and learned from experienced entrepreneurs. Didn't work too early. For whatever reason, it didn't work. Then you moved over to actually working for someone, right? For a tech company.
So no, they were a client So
Okay.
I still had my practice,
Gotcha.
but the company called VanHack, great company, still operating. They brought me in to manage all of their immigration that they were doing. So they were basically like a cash flow version of what we were trying to build,
Mhm.
and they needed help basically doing all their immigration files. And so they brought me in to help with that. But it was all through, I mean, you know how much fun the lawyer regulations are, right? If you're going to charge or do any legal work, it's got to be through the right structure, the right entity. So I always maintained my practice. I still had my own business coming and going, and they were a really good client of mine for quite some time.
That's awesome. Okay, so right, so you're working with VanHack. Eventually, you left, right, and then you were, or you stopped doing that kind of work for them and launched Visto. Before we jump into that, though, I don't know, what did you learn from VanHack? I mean, obviously, a little bit more of an established company. They helped you with your business. You helped them in terms of managing some of the inbound immigration work. How was that experience how was that as a learning experience different from going through the whole pursuit um, you know, story?
Yeah, it's a good question. And now that I look back, because I haven't really been asked that question or thought about it too much, is they were really two amazing experiences of two different types of approaches to business, right? One of which is, hey, let's start this high growth tech company. The second one is, hey, we already have this established cash revenue generating business that's helping a lot of people. How do we optimize it? How do we grow it, et cetera, et cetera? So that really kind of showed me the other end of the totem pole, or the scale, so to speak. And that was working with a bigger team, working with more people. I mean, they were helping dozens, actually hundreds of engineers a year get jobs and relocate to Canada. And so I got to see what that looked like. I also got to see that there were bigger companies in Canada solving immigration problems at scale, right? And so what does that look like? What are the people like? What's it like working in smaller or bigger teams? And just meeting other good people in the space, right? Because immigration tech, just immigration and as it converges with tech is an extraordinarily small market. And as you can imagine, in Canada specifically, it's an even much smaller market. So met some great people that I'm still in touch with today, and learned a lot, did a bunch of good work for them. They did a bunch of, we did a bunch of good stuff together, and they ended up bringing somebody in-house. And so we went our separate ways, totally amicably. And it definitely helped me learn a lot about the cash flow type of business that they were running and the potential there.
Yeah, no, and there's a lot that you can learn from corporate. Having worked in corporate for a number of years myself, yes, it wasn't exact. I don't think it was right for me from a personality fit perspective or what have you, at least, in my experience. But man, you learn so much working for an organization that is bigger, that is successful, that is running, well. There's definitely a lot that you can learn from that. So I do want to say, again, for folks listening, drop some comments, some questions. We will get to them shortly, and thanks all for chiming in live. So Josh, I think where we are in your story is that you're practicing this whole time. You're becoming more and more of an expert in global talent stream and just Canadian immigration, high skilled Canadian immigration. You're going through various experiences in parallel on the technology space. And eventually you say, all right, I'm going to go off and go at it again, I suppose, and build my own platform, which is Visto. So can you chat a little bit about when and how you decided, like, what was that point at which you decided it's time for me to do this again? Because in a sense, you've been burned, right? And a lot of people might say, look, I tried it, I couldn't do it. Great experience. I learned a lot. I'm just going to sort of stay in my lane, be a lawyer, work with VanHack or whomever, continue to build my life. But something drove you to continue on with this sort of entrepreneurial journey. Can you talk a little bit about that, maybe that moment or that moment in time, if you can remember, and then sort of how did that turn into what Visto is today?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll say first and foremost about you could make the argument I got burned. I would make a much stronger argument that I learned a hell of a lot, right? Maybe I should like quote that, learned, not burned, or, you know, something like that. But I didn't see any of those experiences as like failures. And I think it's important to not consider them as such, because then all they're going to do is hold you back, right? What you should look for is what can you take out of those things. And even when we stopped operating, you know, the business that we were operating at Pursuit, what we did was we made sure to discuss what went wrong, right? And why we thought this wasn't the right time for this company, so that you learn from that experience amongst all the other things that I had learned. So I saw those as like learning curves, to be honest. But then what happened, Roman, is when you were talking about your transition to tech, I basically reiterate like 95% of that, which is I was now working. So it had been about probably 2 years into my practice, working primarily with tech companies around the country, helping them bring in engineers from around the world. And I got bored of filling out their paperwork, number one. Number two, I started paying closer attention to the companies and realized, you know, they're doing some pretty cool stuff with cool teams, solving big problems, leveraging technology, helping a lot of people. And nobody was doing that in immigration, really, at all. I mean, there was a little bit of innovation happening, but nothing very groundbreaking. And so I started thinking about, there was not one moment, but there was probably a long months and months where I was thinking to myself, there is an opportunity here. I know it because I'm in the market, right? I know how many of these companies are sponsoring people. I know how many people are interested in moving to Canada. I know how friendly Immigration Canada is and how they're implementing all these new programs to bring more students here and bring more workers here, because quite frankly, we need them or our economy is in trouble. And what I spent probably a couple months thinking about is, what would immigration tech look like in Canada? If I were to snap my fingers and start the next tech company or a Canadian tech company around immigration, what would it look like? What's the first problem we should try and solve? And that's not a question you should answer overnight. So that took months and months of thinking and iterating. But those are kind of the key factors that pushed me towards starting Visto.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. You don't just wake up one day and say, "Oh, there's a new company."
Well, some people might, right? Yeah. Some people might, and maybe they work, maybe they don't. But there was, for those people who might be, you know, working full time now, thinking about, oh, I'd love to start a company one day. You probably shouldn't just wake up and have this perfectly planned business in your head and quit your job and start working that day, right? It takes some time, and it should take some thoughtful time, right? You're doing some research, you're doing some thinking, you're going on walks, you're meditating, you know, whatever you got to do to kind of let your brain work its magic. And then the opportunity tends to, don't wait too long, but the opportunity tends to present itself, or it gets to a point where you feel like, I have to try this. The forces pushing you towards trying it are stronger than the forces saying, oh, you know what, you should just keep doing what you're doing because it's working pretty well, type thing.
Yeah. And also, you know, taking some steps after you're meditating, you may talk to people, run your idea by folks, get it validated as early as possible with whatever you need. Don't sink a lot of time or a lot of money rather into it. And certainly don't quit your job too early. Sometimes I thought I quit my job too early, but obviously in hindsight, it all feels perfect. But I remember at the time it was like, well, I got to do it now. Actually, for me, that moment was I was trying to take too many calls during the workday with just like just talking to lawyers, talking through my ideas, showing them stuff. You know, you could take a little half hour or hour call here and there, but when you're working for somebody, you don't want to do that, especially if it's a 9-to-5 kind of job. You can't just, push over work till later in the day. So it felt that there was enough momentum where I needed to do this, because if I don't, and I don't take these meetings, this thing is going to flounder. But that was, to your point, that was then what tipped the scale of pushing me towards moving forward rather than staying to where I am today. So, give us, as we kind of round off your story, I'm curious, Give us a little bit of information about Visto. I mean, I know a little bit about it, but obviously for some of the folks listening, what it does and sort of what your vision is for Visto going forward. And if you could tie that into what's happening today with Canadian immigration, I'd love to hear your thoughts on sort of where the entire market and industry is moving.
Yeah, so ultimately, Visto is a free portal. It helps international students and skilled workers navigate Canadian immigration. And what I realized pretty quickly is that businesses have no problem, writing the checks that they have to write so they can get the services that they need in terms of sponsoring workers and bringing them over and stuff like that. But when I I started considering more of like a B2C model and started looking at the individuals who are abroad looking to come to Canada and weighing their options, it became pretty clear that the options were just pay a lot of money to a lawyer or a consultant, which there's nothing wrong with doing, but not everybody has that amount of money. And the only other option was to kind of figure it out by yourself, right? Navigate the Canadian immigration website, watch YouTube videos, read forums, and there's nothing wrong with those things. But sometimes you might not want to trust what's coming from the other side of the keyboard. It can be very difficult, especially if you have a confusing situation. And quite frankly, it's just a stressful process to go through by yourself, right? Immigration is huge. It's a big life decision. It's probably one of the biggest decisions some people make in their life. And there wasn't one place anybody could go to get kind of everything they needed in one place. And with the option to kind of pay as you need it in a more affordable manner. And quite frankly, nobody was using tech to make it easier, right? Lawyers aren't exactly known for their tech innovation. And so we built the portal. The first version went live in January, and it started gaining momentum. And then what we realized is the portal was good. People liked the concept. They liked the resources. We were gaining more users, but we needed to give a better user experience. We were getting all this feedback, right? I'm doing user calls. I'm getting their feedback. We're learning. We're seeing what people like to see, what they don't like to see. And then we relaunched the second iteration of it in May, which has performed a lot better, much better user experience. We're kind of gating content and hand-holding people through the process based on what step they're at in the immigration process. And then, Mr. Trump, President Trump, I should say, decided to, different governments have treated COVID very differently, right? And pretty much from day one, Canada has done almost everything it could. Immigration Canada has done almost everything it can to make immigration still as convenient as possible for those trying to apply or who have applied or will be applying. And the US has done the opposite, right? So they've shut down the H-1B program through 2020 to those that are outside of the country. There was a big scare for international students at one point where they, I forget what the terminology, but they basically told international students if your courses were online, you'd have to leave. They've since overturned that, but that really shook up people inside the US who were international students and H-1Bs. And for those outside of the US, it definitely didn't paint a very good picture, because for all of those people I just mentioned, immigration, until you become a citizen, immigration is something that hangs over your head, right? It's something you need to think about every couple of years, either to renew a certain visa or upgrade to a certain status, et cetera, et cetera. And so to have to go through all of that in a country that clearly doesn't have your best interests in mind is just an even further added stress, as I could only imagine, right? I've only ever lived in Canada. I have not had to go through that, fortunately. And so I've spoken to more H-1Bs in probably the last 2 weeks than the last 2 months, because people are opening up their eyes a little bit and seeing there's two parts to it, right? There's how hard is it to actually be eligible and apply and get approved? And then the second piece that a lot of people keep in mind is, am I gonna sleep well at night, right? Am I gonna have to wait 15 years to get my green card? Am I gonna have to pray that they don't institute a new bill or something that tells all H-1Bs to leave, because Canada has never done that, and they probably won't ever do anything like that, right? So I would feel much more comfortable coming to Canada on a work permit or a study permit or through PR in the long run and the short run than going to the US. And so we've seen a big uptick in interest on our portal and for the services that we sell within the portal. And, you know, I'm very interested to look back on this moment in time, 1, 2, 3 years down the road, and say, was that an inflection point where things changed significantly, right? More tech companies opening up shops in Canada, more of the skilled workers from overseas just coming straight to Canada, more of the high school graduates, the top level high school graduates coming to study in Canada, right? As opposed to the US. We don't know what the mid or long-term effects will be yet. We're already starting to feel some, and it'll be interesting to see. And I'm interested to hear your thoughts on, you know, how that's going to play out over time.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you in terms of the treatment has been quite different. You also missed that beforehand, the original executive order, which was based off of one of President Trump's tweets, where I think he said something really broad, like, I'm going to shut down immigration. Now, to a lawyer, that's a specific thing. Immigration are people coming in on permanent residency and citizenship purposes. Whereas there's also something called non-immigrants, which is more of a term of art in the legal space rather than a sort of regular vernacular. But for folks who see a tweet, they just think all influx of people. Mm-hmm. So you're right. I mean, even though that executive order didn't have, as many people say, it didn't have the teeth that people thought it would. I mean, the picture it painted wasn't very pretty. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I'm having a lot of conversations with folks too. And the interesting thing is that, you know, until just recently, maybe not within the past 3 months, but probably within this past administration, folks are just talking about Canada more. Like before this, people that came to America from an immigration standpoint just never talked about Canada. At least that's what I saw, not as much. And now it is a very, very viable plan B. I mean, it is in many cases a plan A.
Well, that's the big question, right? Does Canada soon become the plan A?
Yeah.
For a lot of people outside of North America, it has already become plan A, right? Because there might not even be a decent option for them to get into the US. Meanwhile, everything Canada has done up until today still is, and I've been pretty impressed with some of the exemptions and amendments they've made to certain applications and programs to still basically send the message of, hey, we still value immigrants, whether they be through permanent residence or the term we use is temporary residence, right? Like a work permit or a study permit or a visitor. We still value you. And this is what we're going to do to make Canada a viable option for you, even though COVID's having some difficult effects, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with students, letting them start their semester abroad and still be eligible for a work permit, or and just generally putting out news that says, hey, don't forget about us. We still want you. Mm-hmm. Just that's nice.
Yeah.
I agree. We'll see what happens. I think in part, we'll see what happens also with the U.S. employers. I mean, look, at the end of the day, people around the world do still want to come and work for the Facebooks, the Googles, the Amazons, the JP Morgans, you know, the large corporates that make up a lot of the American economy. If those corporates establish a really strong presence in Canada, then I think that'll also be a huge pull factor as well.
I mean, just walk around downtown Toronto, you'll see some pretty recognizable logos all around and outside of downtown Toronto. It's already happening, right? Yeah. I mean, Amazon's, the Shopify, well, Shopify was based out of Ottawa, but the Amazons, the Facebooks, the Googles, they all have offices here already, right? Mm-hmm. It's just a matter of how big do they get or how many more do they open. It'll be interesting to see, especially as it only becomes easier to bring and keep talent here as opposed to in the States.
Yeah. And like, you know, the long-term effect of all this is that the folks who leave Shopify eventually, or who you know leave the Amazon or the Facebook offices in Canada, presumably that have made a good amount of money, are going to be the next Shopifys. And if they're based in Canada, and if there's a good VC ecosystem, and if there's just a good growing network of tech talent, they're not going to move down to San Francisco or somewhere else. So we'll see what happens. A lot of Slack, for example, started in Canada, right? I mean, the HQ is in San Francisco, but Slack is, as far as I understand, a Canadian company. Research in Motion, right? The old BlackBerry, which I loved. I love my BlackBerry. I missed it, man. When I got my iPhone and I didn't have real buttons to press, it was really, really a difficult transit. Probably the hardest moment of my life. That's a Canadian company, and that was one of the earlier ones. And a lot of folks who graduated, if you will, from Research in Motion have probably themselves become entrepreneurs. And so there's this trickle down effect of tech, a growing tech ecosystem that will then eventually create the next big company that people want to come, not to their satellite office in Canada, but to HQ in Canada.
Right.
So we'll see. So I want to, get to some of the questions that we've had. I mean, this is really an awesome conversation, and you and I can go on forever about sort of where Canada is leaning versus the US. And obviously we don't know what's going to happen in November. But so let's take some questions. So Gabby from LinkedIn, loving this discussion. Thank you, Gabby. Really appreciate it. What does it mean to automate the immigration process? In other words, how does the technology work with multiple stakeholders, such as the company, employee, HR, dependent applicants, et cetera?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Gabby. And we're tackling it from a B2C aspect, right? So we're actually going right to the individuals themselves who are submitting their own applications. So in Canada, study permit, PR applications specifically. So the good thing about that is, well, I guess the good thing about all immigration applications is that it comes down to, if you can shed the fat, we'll say, of a whole entire immigration process, it comes down to, at least in Canada, filling out forms and including supporting documentation and making sure the forms match the documentation, right? So what I've gotten half decent at in the last year is stripping down the immigration process into the bare essentials and leveraging technology to take people through it, right? So, okay, what is step one? I'll take, for example, Canada's PR program for skilled workers is called Express Entry. And that's probably where most of our content in the portal right now is around, because it's one of the more, like for a study permit, you get an approval letter from a school, and then you can submit the application. The PR application is points-based, so you got to figure out eligibility and score and how to, what do you need to calculate your score and stuff like that. So it's a little bit more confusing. So what we do in the portal, and what we're starting to do more and more with software and automation, is how could a computer take you through all of those steps, right? And I can relate it to your scenario. If your company hires a lawyer to submit an application, and I know this because I did dozens of them for Canadian companies, really what it comes down to is me telling the company, hey, I need these documents from you. I need this information from you. And going to the employee and say, hey, I need these documents from you. I need you to fill out these forms. Then I take it, I review it, I organize it, and I submit it online. So how do we break that down into concrete steps in an order that makes sense? If you can do that, you can automate it, right? So what we do in the portal right now is, first step, here's where you need to go to check your eligibility. Second step, here's where you need to go to check your score. By the way, in order to calculate your score, you need these two things. Here's the links and instructions on how to get them. Okay, you figured out your score. Now, based on your score, here's what you should do, right? You should do that. You have a high score. Great, you should go create your profile. Oh, you have a medium score. You might not want to create your profile, but here's 2 or 3 things you can do to raise your score. Or, you don't really have a chance in this application. Here are a few other applications you can go down that might give you a good path to Canada. And then we have content on each application, right? So it's okay, I want to apply for a study permit. Step 1, you have to apply to Canadian colleges or universities. Step 2, you got your letter of approval. Now you need to start preparing the application. Here's where you find the forms. Here's what you need to prove for your proof of financial support. Here's what we recommend writing in a letter of explanation. Basically breaking it down into steps so that we can also then start automating those steps themselves, right? So right now, because we're at the earlier stage, It's guidance and in the form of text and video guides and links to where people need to go to get stuff done. Where we see this going in the future is a web flow that literally says, hey, upload your passport here, upload your form here, upload your reference letter here, where the software can then actually review the documentation and organize it for you and then say, hey, click this button and you can apply, right? Like one click apply or something like that. So especially in a situation where there's multiple stakeholders, in Gabby's case, a company, an employee, a lawyer, HR, right? Something that can kind of organize all those pieces in one place and also notify all those individuals of where the whole process is at.
Yeah, I love that. There's also a thing of if there's a repetitive process as part of the immigration piece, that can always be automated. The other kind of SaaS trope, if you will, is, hey, if you use a spreadsheet for it, there can probably be a text solution. So that's a great explanation, Gabby. Hope that answers your question. Another question here from Abheet Chawla Josh. What are your thoughts on automating contracts? Many companies have failed. What's the current state in Canada?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Abheet. And so we are based out of what's called the Legal Innovation Zone. It's a branch of the DMZ, which is an incubator based at Ryerson University. I believe it's one of the biggest university-run incubators in the world. And so what that means is I'm surrounded by some other legal tech companies that are operating out of downtown Toronto. And so there are a couple of them that are going after contracts. To be honest, one of the biggest difficulties I think a lot of them face, which is another reason why I'm happy to be B2C, is they have to sell to lawyers and law firms, right? So you have to firstly, similar how I was saying about Pursuit, we have to get our clients on board, right? It's a difficult sales process. Selling to lawyers can be a very difficult sales process. Roman, I probably don't have to explain that to you, but very hesitant to innovate, very hesitant to, pivot away from how things have been in the past. Not that and everybody should always pivot and innovate constantly, but even more so, there seems to be some lag in Canadian legal tech. I'm not, from what I hear, similar in the US, probably similar around the world. I would wager legal tech is probably one of the most lagging tech industries, maybe in the world, right? I don't know what other type of tech is out there that might really be lagging behind. But a big struggle is getting lawyers on board to actually use the platforms so that they can stay afloat and the lawyers can actually use them and sell them with their clients. Now, that being said, there's a couple of companies that are doing pretty good work. So it can be done and it has been done. I don't, none of them are really big enough that you might have heard, especially if you're not in Canada. I'm not sure where Abheet is located, but there's definitely a good chunk of good companies trying to solve the problem, and hopefully they can sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and contracts are also it's also a challenge because there's a lot of sort of machine learning that might have to go in there. There are a lot of contract automation companies that I'm seeing, at least, not to your point, outside the immigration space, that are trying to implement true artificial intelligence in the sense of like pulling all of the vocabulary, creating context, teaching the algorithm, what sort of language is relevant to what type of contract, creating suggestions, right? Suggestion algorithms, et cetera. Yeah,
it's tough, right? Because the legal industry is built on, I want to go to a person to get their specific experience and knowledge in what can be a very complicated space. And so I would imagine it takes that much more time and work to put that into an algorithm or AI or whatever it might be, number one. Number two, you then have to convince the people that are either going to use it or pay for it or both that they should use it or pay for it or both, which is, a slightly different conversation.
Yeah, to your point, it is hard to sell. Question here from Sean Griggs. What's going on, Sean? I'm thinking of relocating my young family from London to Canada. What city would you recommend looking at?
It's a good question, Sean. I think it really depends on what you're looking for in a city. Canada is the second largest country, I believe, in the world by landmass. So it's big, and not by population, but it's big geographically. And there's a wide variety of how cold each city gets. No, but there's a wide variety of, whether you want the big city feel, or the mountain ranges, or, smaller town feel, et cetera, et cetera. So what most people would say is, especially if you're looking for a job it would also be good to know, what industry you might work in. But if we're talking about like tech or working for big companies, probably the big 3 or 4 are Toronto, which biggest city in the country, big downtown core, a lot of big companies, a lot of innovation, a lot happening in the tech scene, et cetera, et cetera. Vancouver on the West Coast, so you're by the water, does not get as cold, much better, mountain ranges, more scenery. If you're into skiing, if you're into hiking, probably you're better off there. Montreal gets much colder, but really cool downtown area, really big in the AI space specifically. So a lot of AI tech companies there, a lot of those big American tech companies we mentioned, Facebook, Google, they all have offices in Montreal. Really cool downtown area, a lot of good food, et cetera, et cetera. Ottawa, it's where I'm born and raised. Government town, so it is a city of 1 million people. It's pretty big, but it's also quieter government town. The traffic on the way home starts at 3:30 for all the government workers, and by 5:30 you can hear crickets in the downtown core. So those are kind of like the big 4 you might want to look at first. But that being said, there's plenty other great cities, right? You could look at Calgary, you could look on the East Coast as well. It's more of a, I'd say, personal question based on what you're looking for.
Also, Sean is he's in the global mobility and HR space. Shout out to Sean and Alex from Global Mobility Executives. But yeah, I would think from a global perspective, Toronto. I've been to not many. I've never been actually out on the West. I had a trip planned to Whistler a bunch of years ago, and for one reason or another, I ended up going somewhere else, and I was really bummed because I've always wanted to go snowboarding in Whistler. But Toronto is like so multinational. There are people from all over the world. It feels very, very much like New York City. I really love Toronto. And of course, coming from the UK, English being the primary language for the most part in Toronto, I guess it's a bit easier than going to, for example, Montreal or Quebec City or something like that, where there's a mix, but it is Francophone, I suppose, right?
Well, there's definitely a lot more French in Quebec. But
Yeah.
if you, pretty much anywhere outside of Quebec will be, definitely English first.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. If anyone has any other questions, Sean, you're welcome. Anybody have any other questions? Drop them here. Before we jump, Josh, I had one last question for you, which is, we talked about sort of what you recently launched with Visto and sort of the iterations and what you're doing, and of course, contextually how Canadian immigration is really changing and shifting and growing truly. Curious, what's your vision for Visto? What's your vision for broader Canadian immigration tech? As regardless of what happens, look, it's going up, right? It's not going to, unless something tragic happens, there's not going to be anything massive in terms of a downturn for Canadian immigration. Where do you see Visto going? Where do you see it fitting into the broader Canadian immigration tech space, and sort of where are you seeing Canadian immigration tech go forward from here?
Yeah, well, what we're focused on doing now is just automating more of the process. So we already have kind of the portal is live, right? People can, if you're interested, Sean, I would recommend signing up, Visto.ai. You can learn about the different options for relocating to Canada, whether that be through PR, study permit, getting a job, stuff like that. We want to now continue to build more and more tools that will handhold people through the process without the need for a lawyer. So that's the end vision, not only to prepare your documents, but actually have them reviewed and edited as well, all in one place. Beyond that, we also want to help with the rest of the journey, right? So what ends up happening for a lot of people outside of the country that they're relocating to is you get your approval letter, But that's really the start of the journey, right? You get your approval letter. Okay, now you have to book a flight. You have to find an apartment or a house or a condo. You need a new bank account. You need a new cell phone number. You need an internet plan. You might need cable, right? You need all of these things. And so you're kind of left on your own to figure them all out and find them in different places. So we want to complete the immigration journey by offering all of those either in-house or, at least to begin with, recommending reliable service providers where people can turn to, right? Obviously, we're not getting into banking anytime soon. So we'd love to recommend a bank that is offering, newly landed specials for Visto users who are landing in Canada, and they don't have to think twice, right? Because if I had to move to New York City tomorrow, sure, I could look up the banks, I can look up the cell phone providers. I don't know which one's good, right? Which one should I use? I'd probably end up calling you, Roman, and another couple friends of mine in New York and ask for recommendations. What if there was one portal that said, hey, this is our partner. You can rely on them like you just relied on us. Here's a 25% off discount. Click here, get started, right? Something like that.
If it's a New York City portal, it's not going to say, hey, it's going to say, yo.
Yeah, there you go. Well, that's a good segue, because the other thing we want to do is expand to other countries. And unfortunately, expansion won't be to the US anytime soon because of the current immigration programs and the outlook they're taking. But there are plenty of other immigrant-friendly countries with similar merit-based immigration programs, like what's called express entry. So like in Canada, the equivalent to a green card, you can get in 6 to 8 months if you have a high enough score, right? And some people sit working in the US, pay US taxes for 15 years and don't get a green card. But there are other countries like Canada that have points-based programs for permanent residency, more friendlier approaches to international students, stuff like that. We want to give people the option of weighing which countries and which programs would be the best fit for them, right? So you go through our portal and you can learn not only, hey, should I go on a study permit, permanent residence, work permit, but also, heck, which country would actually be the best fit for me? Or the world is your oyster, right? Oh, you have a really high score. Most of the scores are calculated the same way, right? Age, work experience, education experience. So someone who has a really high score can now say, oh, where do I want to move? Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK. Those are kind of like top of my head, some of the friendlier countries with regards to immigration. But we see this as much more than just a Canadian opportunity.
I think global immigration, I think the world is getting smaller, despite what's happening with COVID, and, we'll see what happens in terms of a vaccine and things like that. And of course, travel is sort of way down. But, for the most part, I feel that the world is still smaller than it ever was, and it will continue to be this way. And we might travel differently. We might immigrate differently. We might have to enter countries differently, but we will continue to do that, I believe. So yeah, totally agree with you. And I'm excited to see what happens with immigration tech, and, both here in the US, for you in Canada and around the world. And, appreciate what you're doing, and thank you for, for sharing information, both about the Canadian immigration and also the immigration tech that you're building. So just for folks who want to reach you, how can they go and find out about you and your company?
Yeah, especially if you're watching on LinkedIn, just try and spell my last name right. Add me on LinkedIn, or wherever you're watching this. Shoot me a message. Mention that you saw the video on Roman's show. Definitely check out Visto.ai if you're interested in relocating to Canada or moving to Canada, whatever it may be. Definitely check us out, Visto.ai. If you sign up, you get an intro email from me, which is my email address, so you can reach out there with any questions as well. Those are probably the two I check most often. I also like to share my thoughts, especially in the last few months, right? There's been a lot of updates with immigration, travel restrictions, processing times, stuff like that. So I'm usually posting on LinkedIn once or twice a week, at least, with updates and my thoughts on them and how they kind of affect people as well.
And then you have a podcast, which I love. So I want to plug your podcast just because I really, really like it. Can you plug it, and then we'll let everyone get back to work?
Yeah. So the podcast started about 2 years ago when I was practicing law, but I still had that entrepreneurial itch to scratch. And like you, Roman, one of the inspirations for this show, and similarly to my podcast, is wanting to learn more from other solopreneurs who were starting and running their own businesses. So I started the podcast. It's called Solopreneur Grind. I think episode 74 is going live on Sunday. So I've spoke to over 70 solopreneurs from a wide variety of industries, immigration, coaching. I've had semi-professional athletes, content creators, almost anything you can think of, domain, people who would buy and flip domains, buy and sell websites. Super, super interesting. And it's kind of like this, 35, 50-minute show, pretty casual Q&A. And what I dig into is how they got started and the struggles they went through and the lessons they've learned along the way.
Awesome. Thanks for
and that's at solopreneurgrind.com. You can, if you look me up on LinkedIn. Actually, no, it's not. I got to add that to my LinkedIn profile now that I think about it.
I'll drop some links below.
Awesome.
Well, thank you again, Josh, so much for coming on, for sharing your journey, and for talking to us about Visto. Thank you for everyone for joining, for asking your questions, leaving your comments. I didn't get to mention all the comments, but we had some folks, so I'll just shout them out. Andres Vargas says hi, and Isaac George says hi, Roman and Josh. Jared Jascott says Canada's stealing all of our talent. Trying to stir up some conversation down in the comments. And thanks again, Sean, for your questions and your insights, and everybody else for joining. So, Josh, thank you again. Really appreciate your time here.
Thanks for having me, Roman. Thanks for the show. It's a great idea to spread, we need to spread more awareness around immigration tech in general. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. Andres, I know, is a Visto user, so shout out. And have a great weekend, everyone. Thanks very much for tuning in.
So just wanted to say thanks again to everyone. Make sure to check back next Friday, 4 p.m. Eastern, and every Friday going forward, we'll have more immigration tech founders. We will have folks talking about marketing in the immigration space. GMI Rocket is the community, so find me on LinkedIn and to learn more about the free GMI Rocket community, which is for global mobility and immigration professionals, whether lawyers, paralegals, mobility professionals, whatever. Learn about. We talk about marketing. We talk about LinkedIn. We talk about growth. The whole idea here is growing our businesses, growing the tech scene within immigration around the globe. So thanks again, everybody. Appreciate your comments. Appreciate you watching, and have a wonderful, wonderful weekend.